Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, after days of deadlock, EU leaders have begun proposing their new leadership team, nominating Germany's Defence Minister, Ursula von der Leyen, as the new president of the European Commission, with Belgium's Prime Minister, Charles Michel, heading the European Council. Another big-name appointment is on the cards too, with the IMF chief, Christine Lagarde, to become president of the European Central Bank. All this after the new European parliamentary session in Strasbourg began in some chaos. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent, Jonathan Rugman, is in Strasbourg. Jonathan.
Grish, I think the main takeaway from these announcements as far as the British government is concerned is that a German is still calling the shots on the Brexit negotiations in Europe. I'm not talking about Angela Merkel, the Chancellor, who's been doing that for the last 3 years, but now her Defence Minister, Ursula von der Leyen, is nominated as the President of the European Commission, a member of Merkel's own party. And with Michel Barnier staying on as EU negotiator, you still have a German and a Frenchman calling the shots on the negotiations over Brexit, which might suggest to a new British Prime Minister, whether that's Jeremy Hunt or Boris Johnson, that there might not be as much flexibility on those negotiations as either of those candidates would like, although there were certainly other candidates for the top job that they would have liked less. Now, why has there been so much horse trading over the last 3 days? Well, the simple fact of the matter is that the so-called Spitzencandidate system, the system of choosing a main, obvious lead candidate, has broken down because the centre-left and the centre-right in the European Parliament have not commanded the usual overall majority that they usually do. And so there has been more negotiations behind the scenes in Brussels to find compromise candidates from the right gender and from small countries and from big countries. This is what's been happening in Strasbourg today before the announcements about these appointments in the last hour or so. It's the first day of school, and one Nigel Farage, its naughtiest boy for the last 20 years, is now head of the joint biggest party in the entire European Parliament. In theory, he and his fellow 28 Brexit Party MEPs will be expelled from here by October the 31st. But Mr Farage does not sound entirely convinced.
Oh, we'll be gone by the 1st of November. We are leaving on the 1st of November, aren't we?
Yeah.
We'll see. We'll see. I have a funny feeling we might still be here.
The newcomers posed for selfies at the back of a class they still hope to graduate from in just 4 months flat. Until, that is, Beethoven's Ode to Joy rang out, the European anthem, and at that they turned their backs. With a record 16 MEPs, the Lib Dems are counting on more deadlock in Westminster, meaning they will keep their seats here. They clogged the corridors this morning, a phalanx in yellow, their fate dependent on a new British Prime Minister failing to see a new Brexit deal through.
Stop Brexit!
Aren't you running out of time to stop Brexit?
No. We will fight to our last breath to stay in the European Union, and we will do everything that we can. And this is a message to our colleagues here in the European Parliament that we don't want to leave. I know that they don't want us to leave, so we must all work together to stop Brexit.
But isn't it true that the biggest British party in the European Parliament is the Brexit Party?
But there were more votes cast for Remain than from the Brexit Party.
1.1 million more.
They have money, but we have votes.
Speaking of money, what about the £450,000 a Channel 4 News report alleged was being used to bankroll Nigel Farage after the Brexit referendum, the money coming from companies belonging to Arron Banks? A European Parliamentary Committee recommended the highest penalty for a serious breach of conduct.
I've never seen anything more disgusting in all my life. You know, coming up with a whole series of nonsensical findings. The idea that I've received some vast sum of money, which
well, 450,000 quid.
Absolutely not true. Just simply not true in any way at all. A misinterpretation of a stolen set of accounts. Not true in any way at all.
Just to be clear about that, so the 13,000 a month for a house in Chelsea, not true?
Well, I'd use of a property in London, not the exclusive use, but use of a property in London. That's true. But if you look at all the numbers, what's being presented is simply untrue.
So how much was it? If it wasn't,
I've no idea.
If it wasn't 450,000 from Aaron Banks' companies in the year after the referendum, how much was it?
A tiny fraction of that. A tiny fraction of that.
So the outgoing president of the European Parliament, has he said to you he's not going to take any action? Or, because obviously he's about to lose his job.
I met with the outgoing president yesterday. We've been through it all. He understands there's not a penny of taxpayers' money involved in any of these allegations, and that's key. He's asked me to declare one or two things, which I'm perfectly happy to do.
So what have you got to declare?
Things that I don't think should be declared, such as the use of an office in London during the referendum. But look, these are very small technical things.
So what else has he been asked to declare? This morning, a declaration of travel to America in 2016 briefly appeared on Farage's official European Parliament page before it was taken down. Perhaps because the Parliament's president, Antonio Tajani, has made no official announcement that the Brexit party leader really is in the clear, and the Italian wouldn't talk to us. It was a turbulent first day of term outside too. These protesters for Catalan independence were furious that 3 elected members could not take their seats after the Spanish government refused to recognise them as MEPs. Inside, Majid from Yorkshire was not recognised either. The Green Party MEP says an official asked him to leave the building, apparently believing he was lost and was not supposed to be there. Though all 73 British MEPs really will be leaving come the end of October, if yet another Brexit deadline is actually met.
Jonathan Rugman reporting. Tonight, after 5 weeks of noisy wrangling, all that the vying for the top job is over. You might be surprised to learn the frontrunner didn't get it. Step away from the Conservative leadership race for a moment and consider the appointment of another team, one that may have just as profound an effect on our future. The EU has announced its new lineup, the men and women who will replace the Junckers and the Tusks who've become such a major part of our national wrangling. And this new team is the one that will decide what kind of trading deal we have with Europe in a post-Brexit world. The EU presidency will go to the German Defence Minister, Ursula von der Leyen, a surprise choice after they failed to agree on other candidates. The Belgian Prime Minister, Charles Michel, will replace Council President Donald Tusk, and Christine Lagarde becomes head of the European Central Bank. Get used to their faces. We may be seeing and hearing a lot of them. The day in Brussels then ends with a little more order than it began, amidst sweary T-shirts and silent protests in the Parliament from MEPs who said they didn't want to be there. Nick Watt, our political editor, has been following the day.
A moment of reflection, a brief moment of harmony as the EU anthem wafted through the European Parliament in Strasbourg. And then the party poopers as the Brexit party showed their disdain for the EU. The normally mild-mannered Liberal Democrats had a populist touch too. MEPs from beyond Britain could be forgiven for thinking that tranquility will prevail when the awkward squad finally leaves the club. But up the road in the EU's capital, European leaders have endured an angry and gruelling 3-day summit.
We have chosen 2 women and 2 men for the 4 key positions. A perfect gender balance. I am really happy about it. After all, Europe is a woman.
Ursula von der Leyen will stand down as German Defence Minister to become President of the European Commission. And Christine Lagarde will transfer from the IMF to become President of the European Central Bank. The interim Belgian Prime Minister Charles Michel will become President of the European Council, gifting him the often thankless task of shepherding EU leaders to agreement at their summits. And the Spanish Foreign Minister Josep Borrell will become the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs. The 2 most important jobs for Britain are the new presidents of the Commission and the Council, who will take charge of the final round of Brexit negotiations and future trade talks with Britain. Theresa May had a say in these appointments in what may be one of the final acts by a British Prime Minister in shaping the EU from within.
And of course, once we leave the EU, our relationship with the 27 member states will continue to be important. They're our closest neighbours, and we will continue to be facing the same challenges and wanting to work together, protecting our values.
The Prime Minister's allies are relaxed about these appointments. They believe that Ursula von der Leyen takes an orthodox German view on Brexit, upholding the fundamental rules of the EU whilst being well disposed towards Britain. Charles Michel is seen as less instinctively sympathetic to Britain than his Polish predecessor Donald Tusk, but he is regarded as a more skillful politician.
He is seen as someone who brings parties together, who has experience of finding consensus in really tricky political situations. So for Brexit, that will be important, because whether or not the UK leaves with the deal, it will inevitably at some point have to negotiate a future agreement with the EU. When it comes to the Commission, I suspect EU leaders wanted someone that they felt that they had confidence in, that they could trust to deliver on this, but who also wouldn't let Brexit dominate the EU agenda, because there are lots of other things that are going on.
A joyful voice in far from joyful surroundings. But after an almighty row, the EU once again soldiers on.
That was Nick Watt, and he's with us now. Just give us a sense, Nick, beneath the waters, what is really going on? What was the wrangling doing, and where does it actually leave us?
Well, the view in the UK cabinet is this is basically a Franco-German stitch-up that Angela Merkel has conveniently removed from Berlin Ursula von der Leyen, who could be seen as a challenger to her chosen successor. That's Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer. Emmanuel Macron has given a job to Christine Lagarde that she would find very difficult to refuse. And sadly, this means that she won't be able to be a rival to him in the next French presidential election in 2022. But interestingly, in the cabinet, they believe the real loser is the abrasive Secretary-General of the European Commission, that's Martin Selmayr. Now, his problem is that he's German, and the view is you cannot have a German Secretary-General and a German President of the European Commission. Yeah, they think he will fight like mad to keep his position, but cabinet ministers are very happy. They think he'll go, and they see him as being very confrontational to the UK.
And the new Juncker in this scenario, then, Ursula von der Leyen, she said some quite provocative things in the past. What do we actually know about her and her position?
That's right. Well, look, Eurosceptics have been quick to note her view. She's been very critical of Brexit. She said that events since the referendum had been a burst bubble of hollow promises inflated by populists. She's also classically federalist. She talked about how a European army is a vision that might become reality in generations to come. She's also voiced support for a United States of Europe like Switzerland, Germany and the US. These are absolutely the classic views that Eurosceptics have campaigned against for 20 years and say that's why the UK should not be in the European Union. I spoke to one cabinet minister and said those are the standard views of any mainstream German politician.
Interesting. Nick, thanks very much indeed. We'll be returning, we hope, to the EU Parliament to look at the beginning of the day a little later in the programme.